Welcome, friends, to the Generations Radio broadcast. Kevin Swanson, your host, with you. I'm a homeschool father of 5. We've been broadcasting this program for 9 to 18 years from my basement, and we are competing with NBC, CBS, and ABC. We have taken something of their market share. Not a lot of it, but something of their market share. Me and the other 800,000 podcasters in the world. You got to admit, we're eating into the market share of NBC, CBS, ABC, and Fox, and you know, it's true. We're seeing something of a decentralizing effect when it comes to media. You think about the early 1990s, Steve. You and I could not do this very well without spending an arm and a leg and trying to get on some local network.
Yeah, on some sort of UHF channel, not certainly not on the internet. That would have never happened because that didn't exist. Al Gore hadn't made it yet.
It would have cost me $100,000 a year to get into a local UHF market.
Yeah.
And then I would not have found anything of my niche market quick enough to pay off the incredible debt required to keep that on the air for, 6 months to 6 years. Well, here's what's interesting is Hollywood has died. And we've been talking about this for quite some time, that the lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, the world passes away with its lust thereof, but he who keeps the will of God abides forever. And this has been one of our goals in reporting as part of Worldview in 5 Minutes and our media program as part of what Generations does. We want to chronicle all the time the constant means by which the world passes away with its lust thereof, but he who does the will of God abides forever. That principle comes back again and again throughout human history. It's not as if the wicked prevail and everything's fine. No. The wicked, for a time, they spread out like a big old oak tree, but after a while you look diligently for its place, and it shall not be found. And that's the pattern of history. And I believe that every newscast, every Christian newscast, needs to chronicle what happens as we see the decline of civilizations and the breakdown of these wicked nations, these systems that will not fear God, and in fact do just the opposite.
Yeah, I think maybe Hollywood needs one more awards show, and that might bring them back, right? They have one every day. Yeah.
Now, we've talked about the awards show. It's been pretty miserable. I think we calculated that the number of viewers of the Oscars was about the size of the homeschooling movement in America. So,
Wow.
That means, okay, you're pretty much in the dustbin of history. That's it. You're gone. It's over. Well, Hollywood did $11 billion per year on average throughout the 2000s, dropped off to $2 billion in the box office last year. What is that? An 82% drop off? I mean, that's not very good. Okay. I'm not an economist. I'm not an accountant, but that's not very good. That $11 billion dropped off to $2 billion last year. Now it's sunk to $0.8 billion in the first 6 months of the year. That's not a recovery, by the way. That's not a recovery. In fact, that's going down. That'd be an average of 1.6 for the year, off of $2 billion last year, which is a horrible year, off of $11 billion in 2019. Friends, there's no recovery. In fact, what used to be the cultural leader of the zeitgeist for at least a century is gone. The movie industry completely dominated the thinking of America in the 1920s and 30s. Understand, anywhere between 60 and 80% of Americans were in the movie theater every week in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. So just understand that Hollywood set the moral direction, set the worldview direction for a nation for 100 years. That's over. I mean, at the very least, shouldn't we get some party favors and put on the party hats and celebrate a bit? I mean, by the way, I haven't seen a single story on this. Well, no, I saw one story, one very obscure story written on it. So far, Hollywood's done $0.8 billion in the first 6 months, off from $11 billion last year, or 2019. Cable television's also collapsing. Cable television's collapsing. It'll be down to about 30% of households as of this year. And streaming is taking its place. Now, here's the point. When it comes to streaming, anybody can stream now.
Yeah.
Okay? Anybody can stream. This is massively decentralized. This is the Babel principle that man says, hey, go to, let's make a name for ourselves. Let's create a few television networks. Let's create 4 to 5 motion picture houses, develop some contracts where you're only going to be able to pull your movies off of a couple of different production houses. And let's absolutely centralize and control the content of what 99.9% of Americans are going to get in the movie theater and what they're going to get in cable television and what they're going to get in the few terrestrial television programs that television stations allowed by the United States FCC. And so we'll have this massively centralized, controlled stream of information that is controlled by a very few, and it will be extensively, if not almost completely, controlled by those who are on the left side of things and taking America more in a progressive/regressive direction. This is what happened with television. This is what happened with cable television. It wasn't like anybody could have their own cable television program. No, only the richest of the rich could control what was going on and what kind of content the average person could receive, whether it was in a little farm town in South Dakota or whether it was in downtown New York City. They would create something of a monolithic approach to culture in which the entire world, the entire nation would be taken hook, line, and sinker, taken by the nose by the powers that be, the principalities and powers that controlled the centralized systems for television and the movie theater. That's not going to happen anymore. It's over. It's over. God pulls the plug. Go to. Let's make a name for ourselves. Let's develop a tower. Let's develop a centralized system that will control all the information in a nation. Well, friends, that's over now. Now you've got the decentralized chaos, conflict, the massively diverse offerings of worldviews and opinions and cultures. You get the breakdown of human society, and I'm not sure where we go from here. I just have no idea what happens next. But nobody needs to compete to try to get their movie into the limited number of theaters or cable television channels anymore. No, there's no limited access anymore. It's over. Now every Tom, Dick, and Harry can do their own basement-based podcast, and anybody can create a movie. Anybody can stream something to some particular market. You can develop as many niche markets as you want to by internet. What's happening here? Here's what's happening. Before we take a break, just realize this. God is in control. He's in as much control as he was when Babel came down. God is turning the world upside down, and it's happening like right now. Be back with more in just a moment on the Generations broadcast.
Attention homeschool parents. Here at Generations, we know that finding literature curriculum that engages your children's minds and helps them develop a strong Christian worldview can be an overwhelming task. That's why we've developed a Christian discipleship-focused literature curriculum that's centered around the most important work of literature ever written, the Word of God. Not only do our Bible-centric courses seek to place Christ at the head of literature studies, but they will also teach your children how to analyze all literature from a Christian perspective, enabling them to be more than conquerors in today's battle of worldviews. By introducing them to the essential stories of the faith, along with the written works of history's best Christian authors, our literature curriculum provides the bedrock for a firm foundation of faith in the hearts of your children. So, get started today with Generations Christian Discipleship Curriculum and watch your children embark on an incredible journey towards strengthening their faith and discovering the greatest Christian stories ever told. You can learn more and browse our selection of carefully curated works at generations.org/curriculum. That's generations.org/curriculum.
You are listening to the Generations radio broadcast. Kevin Swanson with you, Steve Vaughn also. Before we're done with this segment of the program, Steve, so many developments happening, not just in culture, but also in politics. And I think the overarching theme is that, God is in control of these things. And we don't know how all of this is going to play out, except for the fact that God is in control. Jesus is far above all principalities and powers, and he is over all things to the church. And we know these basics. But what happens in the next 20, 30, 40 years, hard to say. We certainly are seeing something of a decentralization of powers. We are seeing something of a chaotic situation, a destabilizing situation in media and culture and education, in economics, in social systems, you name it. You can read more of that in Epoch, The Rise and Fall of the West. But this article from Heritage.org, I think, helps us to better understand the big Supreme Court decision that occurred on the Philadelphia question of whether the Catholic adoption agency could exempt themselves from adopting to homosexuals. So that was the question asked by the Fulton court case that was decided by the U.S. Supreme Court last week. Fulton allowed a little freedom. The Fulton decision is allowing a little freedom for the Catholic Social Services in Philadelphia not to adopt the homosexuals. But here's the key. The court allowed it only on a technicality. And so the decision is probably only going to last for about 5 days, maybe about 5 days, maybe 5 weeks, but not much longer than that. It was definitely kicking the can down the road one more time. The Supreme Court took one small step for religious freedom. Unfortunately, it failed to take the giant leap needed to fully protect religious practice. That, according to this article from Heritage.org. In Fulton v. City of Philadelphia, the court considered the plight of the Catholic Church, which has served Philadelphia's needy children in various ways since the late 1700s. For more than a century, Catholic Social Services have contracted with the city to connect children in need of a home with loving foster parents. In 2018, the city suddenly terminated Catholic Social Services contract because it discovered that the agency, in following Catholic Church teaching on marriage, would not place children with same-sex couples, and so on and so forth it goes. The point is that they kicked the can down the road. They didn't decide the question related to the First Amendment. Instead, the court said that based on the specific facts in the case, Philadelphia violated the First Amendment and simply stopped there. Employing its own analysis of Smith, and this is the Smith v. Oregon decision of 1990, the court actually found that the violation occurred because a particular provision in the foster care contract was worded to give too much discretion to a city official. So it was just a technicality. That's all it was. And the court's unanimous judgment in favor of the Catholic Social Services, therefore, will last only until the city changes the wording on the contract, which could happen in about 5 days. Or 5 minutes, as the case may be. So, as Justice Samuel Alito explained, voila, the parties will be back where they started. So, that's the same thing that happened on the Jack Phillips case not 4 to 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And that's why Jack Phillips was back in court and continues to appeal, as he did last week. One more time, he's appealing a decision made by a state court that would throw the book at him for not making a cake for a transgender party. Well, here's again, and this is the article from Heritage.org, and I think this explains the situation, the Smith situation somewhat. In a separate opinion arguing for Smith's abandonment, Gorsuch writes, "It's not as if we don't know the right answer. Smith has been criticized since the day it was decided. No fewer than 10 justices, including 6 sitting justices, have questioned its fidelity to the Constitution. Justice Alito has offered a comprehensive opinion explaining why Smith should be overruled, and not a single justice has lifted a pen to defend the decision. So what are we waiting for?" So it appears it's possible that Gorsuch might do the right thing on a religious liberty case if Smith is reversed. Now, it's hard to say. Gorsuch is probably the most swing vote we've had since Kennedy.
Yeah, and we know where Roberts will probably land. He's we're not quite sure where Roberts will land. He depends on if anybody has anything on him or if he's just feeling a little more liberal that day. But he's not made a whole lot of good decisions. So, but Thomas and Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett probably would like to overturn that one as well.
Well, Gorsuch seems to me is conflicted. He did the wrong thing on Bostock, which threw the book at the funeral home for not hiring a transgender or keeping a transgender in their front office. And there have been a few other instances in which Gorsuch has done the wrong thing. So I still think Gorsuch is up in the air. It's hard to say. The court does appear to be afraid to rule on religious liberty issues. It's interesting. They have kicked the can down the road a number of times. There seems to be something of a fear in the court, a fear of public opinion, a fear of man. And that's why I tend to be a bit negative about the Supreme Court making the right decision. When push comes to shove, when it comes down to the Roe v. Wade or Lawrence v. Texas or the Bostock decision, it seems to me when push comes to shove, unless they fear God, unless they really fear God, rather than men, unless they fear God even above public opinion. You go, oh man, that's pretty significant fear of God. Yeah, it is. You actually have to believe that, the God who made the galaxies exists. The God who is over all things. He's the God who has hellfire for those who are the wicked, who will not repent of their sins and turn to Jesus. This God is the one to fear, the one who not only destroys the body, but destroys body and soul in hell. This one is the one to fear. If they don't fear God, it seems to me that they will do the wrong thing. Now, here's the issue at stake, and I want to be sure that everybody understands the primary issue that will be dealt with by the Supreme Court in some way, shape, or form in the future, and will determine the future of American Christian businessmen first and foremost, but also probably will determine the future of what will happen with Christian pastors who refuse to officiate homosexual weddings or churches that refuse to open up their facilities for homosexual weddings. This is the kind of thing that's going to determine what will happen for Christians. Will they be persecuted by the state, by the liberal states, over the next, say, 15, 20 years? What's the question? And here's the question. It's the Smith decision of 1990. And the Smith decision of 1990 was a decision made by the Supreme Court of the United States in which they prohibited a religious exemption for a drug law required by the state of Oregon, which would have banned the smoking of peyote by Native Americans. And Native Americans insisted that they should be able to smoke peyote because that's part of their religious observances. And so therefore, they felt there should be a religious exemption based on the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution to a drug law that was imposed upon them by the state of Oregon. Now, let's say that smoking peyote is immoral, or let's just say that it's generally immoral. Here's what the Supreme Court might do. If the Supreme Court would allow Native Americans to do something immoral, like smoke peyote for their religious reasons, would they then allow for Jack Phillips to do something moral for his religious reasons and exempt himself from what he perceives to be an immoral requirement, but what the world considers to be moral, and that is to celebrate homosexual weddings? Okay, does that make sense? In other words, if the Supreme Court somehow says, okay, we're reversing Smith and we're going to allow the Native Americans to do something immoral for their religious reasons, that is to smoke peyote, then why not just allow Jack Phillips to do something what we would call moral for his religious reasons and exempt himself from what he perceives to be an immoral requirement imposed upon him by an immoral law, and that is to celebrate homosexual weddings. So, see, Jack Phillips does not want to contribute to homosexual celebrations. The state governments would force him to contribute to a homosexual celebration. And the question here before the Supreme Court of the United States is, should there be a religious exemption for Jack, who does not want to contribute to a homosexual celebration, even though the state law requires him to do so, because the state thinks that this homosexual celebration is just a wonderful and moral thing to do? So that's the question. If they reverse Smith, then that will allow the Native Americans to smoke peyote as an exemption to drug laws. And if they reverse Smith, that will allow Jack Phillips to have a little more freedom to claim the First Amendment, that is a religious exemption for his cake-making business, so he won't have to celebrate the homosexual weddings, which apparently appears to be something of a wonderful and moral thing to do, according to our state today. Okay, so that's the question. So these exemptions might allow for a small sliver of freedom from the highly regulative state. I think at root, Steve, the question has to do with whether the government gets to be God and regulates every single aspect of our lives. And that's one reason why I tend not to be a huge fan of drug laws. I tend not to be a huge fan of drug laws because Now, there are elements of the use of drugs that should be legislated against. There should be some legislation relating to drug laws. But I think one of the root problems we're dealing with here is that people have this impression that every immoral action should be taken care of by a civil magistrate. In other words, if I get angry and start yelling at my neighbor, well, there needs to be a law against that. If I get angry and kick my cat, okay, there needs to be some law about getting angry and kicking cats. That is, there needs to be some kind of a government action against every single immoral deed or what they perceive to be immoral deeds, including the not celebrating homosexual weddings. The assumption is that if we can just legislate against every possible immoral thought, word, and action, maybe that will make everybody moral.
It comes down to, where do our rights truly come from? The government wants to claim that they're the ones who issue rights, and that's why they're saying, okay, well, does Jack Phillip have the right to refuse this service? The government thinks it can give that right, but the First Amendment says the government shall not make a law restricting religious freedom. Our rights come from God, ultimately, and they don't come from the Constitution, they don't come from the government, they don't come from the Declaration of Independence. Our rights come from God, and so we need to revert back to what God says that we are supposed to do and not supposed to do, and that's where we need to get how we act, not from the government.
And stated even more precisely, our rights come from God's laws. When God's law says, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not murder, the flip side of that is a right for those who don't want to be murdered. When God says, thou shalt not steal, the flip side of that is that the government should not steal control over our businesses and tell us who we should do business with and who we should not do business with. So ultimately, our rights come from God's laws, which determine what is right and what is wrong. But I think even more fundamentally, the reason why you live in a regulative state is because, why do we want to regulate every little thing about human society? I think it's because people really do believe that we can develop a righteous state by state laws. But salvation from immorality actually comes not by state action, but it comes by the regenerating work of the Holy Spirit in our hearts, by the preaching of the gospel, by the work of Christ on the cross, of a far more extensive and intensive work of Almighty God to bring about real salvation, not the fake salvation that the humanists concoct for us. By the way, biblical judicial law only legislates against a few things. There's actually about 300 laws in the Bible. Now compare that to, 30 million laws imposed upon us by the state governments and by the U.S. federal code. Have you seen what the U.S. federal code looks like on like a lawyer's bookshelf? I think it goes on for about half a mile, if I'm not mistaken. It goes on and on and on and on and on and on. Biblical judicial law, it's only about 300 laws. And by the way, most people haven't even studied it. Actually, I think in terms of just, plain old-fashioned civil law, it's probably not more than about 60 or 70.
Yeah.
So biblical law does not regulate you to death. It actually just presents more severe punishments for those who commit severe crimes. But what happens in America is the people who commit severe crimes, they're out on parole in like 2 years.
Well, faster now.
That's what happens to people who commit severe crimes. They're out on parole in 2 years. That's what liberals do. And then they regulate everybody else to death with 30 billion regulations. Everybody else to death with 30 billion regulations. Okay, that's the worldview of the left. It creates one of the most miserable states you could ever imagine. And it's just utterly ridiculous. So, of course, the definition of morality is the real problem here. According to the modern worldview, Christians who won't join in with the wonderful celebrations of homosexuality and transgenderism are the immoral and horrible people. Non-Christians who smoke peyote and have sex with everything that moves, they're the wonderful people. So, your fundamental worldview in relation to morality is what's governing the legal codes today. So I think people need to understand that ultimately it's the fact that America has turned against God's law that has presented what we have today. But friends, as we wrap up this edition of the Generations broadcast, I just want everybody to remember that, you know what? Jesus Christ, he ascended to the right hand of the Father. He rules until all of his enemies are under his footstool. And I think we need to remember that. I mean, there's these attempts on the part of man to